So good afternoon and good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name's Ann Pfister. I'm Associate Professor of Anthropology here at the University of North Florida, and I'm Director of the Digital Humanities Institute, or DHI. The DHI promotes collaboration on interdisciplinary projects that combine the use of technology with materials and methodologies from the humanities, fine arts, and social sciences. The DHI is composed of faculty and students across UNF. It's an intercollegial institute bringing student and faculty interests and expertise together through a variety of venues, including today's discussion and several community connections here in Jacksonville. I set a few goals for my 2-year term as DHI director, and as an anthropologist, these include bringing in more social science projects and perspectives and broadening the focus of digital to include technology more generally. After all, in the field of anthropology, technology is nearly synonymous with human culture and ingenuity and is studied as a crucial component of our evolution as a species. In other words, technology is something that makes us very uniquely human. I'm also interested in underscoring the importance of public scholarship. Today's presentation, Ethnographic Filmmaking as Cosmopolitan Product, is part of the quality programming that the DHI has been able to support in the last few years. So before I introduce our guest, we gratefully acknowledge that the University of North Florida is on the unceded ancestral homelands of the Mocama-speaking Timucuans. We recognize that other indigenous peoples also built homelands here, including the Yamasis and Guales. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples made this region into a vibrant center of diplomacy, exchange, and religious practice. We pay respect to these nations and to their descendants. We're very proud to host Dr. Erin Mortieri. Dr. Moriarty is Assistant Professor and Director of the Deaf Studies MA program at Gallaudet University. She's also an honorary research fellow at Heriot-Watt University with the transnational ERC-funded Deaf Mobilities Across International Borders, Visualizing Intersectionality and Translanguaging, led by Dr. Annalise Custers. She's also an affiliated faculty member with the Shukman Deaf Documentary Center at Gallaudet University. Moriarty's work is situated at the intersection of ethnography and applied linguistics. She studies multilingual, multimodal languaging practices, language ideologies, and deaf encounters using visual methods. She has conducted ethnographic research in Southeast Asia since 2009. Her current research project focuses on deaf tourist mobilities in Indonesia and the mobile semiotic repertoire. Moriarty has a PhD in anthropology from American University in Washington, an MA in communications from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and a BA in anthropology and art history from Smith College in Northampton, Mass. In 2014, Moriarty Harrelson was one of 6 people in the first cohort of the Fulbright National Geographic Digital Storytelling Fellowship, where she conducted field work in Cambodia. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Moriarty now.
Thank you for such a lovely introduction. I am thrilled to be with you all this evening. And Anne, you and I met back in Chicago, I believe, and it was so nice to, see and make a connection with you face to face here again. So today I'm going to be giving a presentation about the filmmaking, and please let me know if I need to slow down or speed up. You can share comments in the chat if you need. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. I do have a PowerPoint. I'm also going to be showing you several clips from footage. Zoom can be a little weird when we share clips. It can sometimes freeze up and pause. So I'm also going to include the link in the Vimeo link and the specific moment that you can scroll to so that you can watch it on your own device if for some reason Zoom isn't sharing it smoothly. So with that caveat, I will begin. So today I'm going to talk about various topics and as it relates to ethnographic filmmaking. And I will do so through presenting data about filmmaking itself, how that's different for deaf individuals and sign language research. Also, how film can capture data on linguistics performance and ideologies. Hopefully, we'll be able to bring in some new questions from our interaction here this evening. First, I'd like to explain a little bit about Mobile Deaf and what I'm doing with this organization. So Mobile Deaf ERC is a funded project of 1.5 million euro, and it's investigating a variety of deaf tourism and mobility, or in mobility in language practices. Our lens for this is deaf same. That feeling of deaf same is the topic of a book from 2015, the title of the book from 2015. And the concept is we see a lot of international deaf people often share this sentiment, that sentiment of you and I are deaf, and that means that we can connect on a level that supersedes borders and language and differences. But that is an ideology. We all know, as anthropologists, that ideology almost never matches reality. So people often will hold an ideology and try to connect on the sameness that we have, but still have important and real issues like power differences, unequal access to resources, and oppression. We often saw the phrase, oh, it's such a small world. We saw this often with transnational encounters amongst deaf people. There's a long history of deaf studies research that focuses on this, but it's been focused specifically on short-term privilege mobility, like specific project work, conferences, sports like the Deaf Olympics. So this research project focuses on different types of mobility and immobility. We're also looking at forced migration, labor migration, and things of that nature, professional mobility, and tourist mobility. So the purpose of this is to look at the question, what is cosmopolitanism? This is the sign that I'm going to use for cosmopolitanism. This is a BSL or an international sign creation. So it's not something that we'll use or you'll see being used in American Sign Language, but this is the sign that we've created for cosmopolitanism. So that is, in short, what deaf mobility is. So part of the work that we do with Mobile Deaf is that we work on deaf ethnographic films and filmmaking, which is a new genre. Historically, there's been films about deaf people, films that had deaf characters in them, topics that focus on deafness, like the recent movie Coda that has just been released. But ethnographic film is different. So it's a new genre that we've been working on at Mobile Deaf. I'm sure many of you may be wondering, okay, fine, what is deaf ethnographic film? Well, that's what I'm here for. That's what I'm going to explain today. Deaf ethnographic filmmaking is research just like any other ethnographic film. It's always research-based. There's no script, which essentially means that there is a camera that's capturing footage that's not scripted. So nobody's telling anybody what to do or how to behave. What is distinctive of deaf ethnographic film is that there is technology, filming technology, that really captures the entire body and how the body is being moved when they interact with others. So I went to film school in Manchester, the UK. They have a well-known visual anthropology program there. So I went there for filmmaking school. And what I found interesting is that many of the technology that I was taught is not aligning with what we need when we look at deaf ethnographic filmmaking. So for example, they'll tell you to do a frame shot on the face. So if you have a film about, I don't know, let's say unhoused people here in DC, they'll do a close shot of someone's hands and how it's resting, or they'll do a close shot of someone's face. And that doesn't work when you're looking at how deaf people communicate. You miss essentially everything. So that's a big key difference of how deaf ethnographic filmmaking stands apart from typical ethnographic film. Another important issue is accessible information, accessible dissemination, and how that plays into general scholarship. Oftentimes, deaf people throughout the world have various levels of literacy. They use different languages. They have different levels of access to academic publications. And that's not true for just deaf people. Many academic publications are inaccessible for the general population. And so that's the reason why we decided to do filmmaking, because we want to make sure that our data is more transparent and that it's more transparent about our perspective and our standing as anthropologists, our communication skills, our language use, and those types of considerations. Because oftentimes people who are doing the work in deaf anthropology or in sign language linguistics don't talk about their own fluency with language. And that information is typically left out of the articles that you see published. And that's important to know. It is important to know if the interview is happening through an interpreter or directly with the interviewee. And how is that interviewing happening? Who's involved? Is communication happening on an effortless level? So that is the reason why film is so crucial for deaf ethnography, because you can actually see the data. The film itself is often shaped by the deaf gaze. And that's another part that I'm going to explain a little bit more later. We're going to talk about hearing gaze and how that's different from deaf gaze. Deaf ethnographic filmmaking has its own ethics that we also have to abide by. What's involved in a film, what's not included in a film, and that, again, we will discuss a little bit later. First, I'd like to just introduce the film itself. This film is based on 7 months of fieldwork in Bali, Indonesia. I went to do my fieldwork there to look at deaf tourists and how deaf tourists would interact with locals, what would happen in that encounter, and what shapes that encounter. So what type of language practices do people include, and those types of things. That field work was done in 2018. I followed 2 deaf tour guides. I also was involved in various deaf tourists of various ages, groups. Some were solo travelers, some were traveling with their families, some were traveling with their partners. And so I was the nosy anthropologist asking if I could crash their holidays, essentially. Luckily, they agreed and let me tag along. So essentially, I would follow them around and conduct interviews as they did that. So I did 7 months worth of field work. And then at the end, the last 6 weeks, we had a film team that joined us to make this film that I'm going to introduce. So deaf tourists that you'll see in this film are from Europe, India, and many other countries. We had quite a few Australians. And so they all use a variation of international signs, Auslan, American Sign Language, Indonesian Sign Language. So you will see many depictions of different types of signed languages in this film. I also looked at how people code switch. How do they make those accommodations amongst each other to make themselves understood? And then also, how do they make those code switching decisions to understand others? So first, I want to talk a little bit about what deaf tourism is. So the concept is deaf glocal circuit. So this is an experience that, you know, many deaf people will visit deaf schools, for example, or deaf villages, deaf businesses, deaf-owned restaurants. All of that the goal is the encounter. So the encounter is the heart of that tourist experience. And so that encounter is one of the most valued and the most commodified and essential part of that tourist experience. So it's between the self and the other. And so that encounter is immediate, it's embodied, and it's geographic. People who have capital, who do travel, who involve themselves in these encounters, are also experienced by the people who were already there or here. So I'll show you a brief clip of an example of an encounter in the monkey forest. The monkey forest is a very popular tourist destination. I can't tell you how many times I've been to the monkey forest. I think probably over 50 times with various groups of tourists. So let me stop sharing this PowerPoint and then I will share the clip itself. I'll also post a link just in case there's any kind of difficulty seeing the film. Is everybody able to see this okay? Okay. So I realized I started that film a little bit too soon. What I should have done is started with the monkey forest portion of it. So the point of sharing that video is that, or that particular clip, because there's different layers present. One, you can see how the woman, this deaf woman from Germany, her boyfriend is Calvin, a deaf man from the US. And they're traveling as a group of international deaf people to go to the monkey forest. This woman has a very special cream. You saw that yellow tin that she referenced. And what was fascinating about that moment is that the monkey took the tin of cream and the woman tried to communicate with a hearing man who worked at the monkey forest, who's from Bali. And this hearing individual does not know sign language. And the woman is using gestures to try. She immediately goes through a whole host of different strategies. So she gestures, she points, she vocalizes a little bit. She tries different strategies to communicate to this hearing gentleman that the monkey stole her tin of cream. And this is one example of what film can do for the analysis of language use. It really shows that deaf communicators will use various strategies that are varied and almost unconsciously. The sequence happens so rapidly. She did several examples of strategies within 30 seconds. And so that shows how deaf people are thinking through how to make themselves understood and how to achieve a particular objective. In this case, it would be to communicate. So that was a fascinating moment for me as a linguistic anthropologist who uses film, and it helped to indicate that communication is so much more than just language. It's not just having a language or several languages, but it's really multimodal strategies that are being used. And it's all based on the innate human need to communicate, to understand, and to be understood. So in that brief clip, that led to a very deep and rich insight on ethnography data. Now I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. So next, I'm going to talk about the Deaf Village. So this is Encounters in Benkala. And Benkala is the name of this deaf village that is in Bali. It's also known as Desa Kolok, which literally means deaf village. So this village is called Deaf Village because there is a hereditary gene of deafness. And what's interesting is that people will use the phrase deaf village, but there's only 44 deaf people that live there. And I think that's out of probably about 3,000. So this deaf village is a very popular fieldwork site for genetic study, people who are interested in the deaf gene, also sign language linguists who are interested in child language acquisition, village languages, and Katakalak. So many deaf tourists will visit this location because they're envisioning this as a deaf utopia. In actuality, that's not what it really is. The other thing is that oftentimes in stories or in tourist discourse, they use language like, oh, this place is in the middle of nowhere. It's very remote. It's really far. So they share this story as this big journey that is required to get there. It's 3 hours north and it's off of a main highway. That is what's actually the truth. So, but I think it's interesting how it's framed as being so remote and hard to get to. It's almost as if it makes it more special and it makes it more exotic. So that's just one example of tourist narratives and how people frame this village in particular. To give you a little bit of background about the village, part of my research that I intended to focus on was when I was looking at the history of deaf tourism, because it is vast. There's a lot of deaf tourists that go. It seems to be in the thousands. And I was trying to figure out, how do deaf people know about this place? It turns out that a researcher who wanted to give back to the community, and I use that in quotations, made a video as a fundraising effort about a school that is being established for deaf and hearing children in that village. That video became viral, not on purpose, and it ended up attracting many tourists. Not just tourists, but also journalists, and I use that in quotations. I use the term journalist very loosely, but many hearing filmmakers from Singapore, Japan, and France, those three in particular, whenever I was living in Bali, those are the filmmakers that I saw. They were in Singapore, from Singapore, France, and Japan, talked about Bali as on their travel blogs. And so we would see these being indicated on their shows, and they would feature Benkala often. So it seemed as though to visit Benkala meant that I was engaging in cosmopolitanism, and I was experiencing a more cultured experience if I were to go. Now I'm going to show you another clip. monkeys are a big theme in this, if you can't tell. So that was a long clip, but I think it's important to take some time to talk about this particular one because there were so many layers present. And I do have to admit that I made this clip. I still feel kind of icky when I look through it because there's so many people that are in the film. That's one of the challenges when you're making film is how to show what really happens, what people really say, what people really think, while at the same time not frame it in a negative light or to reinforce a stereotype. And so that's one of the challenges that I've had when creating this film. Because you can see that there's very complicated feelings from those people. The deaf tourists are excited. They want to go see how other deaf people really live. And at the same time, they have a very specific gaze. They're curious about the plumbing, about the house that people live in. They're going into other people's homes. So it's interesting to think about and the experience of exploring to find sameness and trying to connect with other deaf people throughout the world. And in the beginning of the clip, you saw one of the women from the Netherlands sharing that she wanted to see a strong sense of unity amongst the people because cochlear implants aren't an option. So I think that in some ways, some deaf tourists, they see a deaf place or connections in the global South as like untouched, foundational. And that's also very colonial in a way of thinking. I think that that's definitely one of the things that I've personally struggled with as a deaf filmmaker, because these people are deaf, so deaf same, just like me. And also, how do I portray that type of an experience and that type of a view that not everyone in the film may look quote unquote good, even though we all have good intentions, we all value and want connections, we may not look good while we're doing that. And so that's one of the challenges as a deaf anthropologist in working within my own community. So I don't have very much time left, and I think I have about 20 or 30 minutes worth of content. So I'm going to go ahead and share a little bit more. The film is available online. You're welcome to view it at your leisure, but I'm going to move on with the rest of my content. So we've talked about the deaf gaze. Now I want to talk about the hearing gaze. I think that you can see the difference because part of the clip that I showed earlier has a small film that was made by another person. It was The Great Story, that piece of the film, and that shows the hearing gaze. So I was there for field work during that time, and there was a death in the village. So we had a funeral celebration for that person. And in the deaf village, deaf people have a very particular role. Deaf men are responsible for digging the gravesite. And there's different reasons why. Some villagers say that it's because they can't hear the ghosts that are in the graveyard. So they're not afraid when they dig the gravesite. Some say because they're physically strong and they're not afraid because they're physically strong. So I went to the ceremony, and I, again, myself as a deaf person, I noticed that there was a film crew from Japan, and they were interviewing the hearing leader of the village. I couldn't understand what was being said. So I asked one of the hearing people to interpret for me and tell me what was being said in this interview. And that was a really interesting experience from my access point as a deaf researcher, and how I am like deaf villagers, because you would see this deaf man in the background digging a grave while there was another person talking about him, and he had no idea what was being said. So I demanded access. I was the one that said, somebody needs to interpret what's going on. I want to know what's being said. But the deaf man digging the grave didn't do that. And I think that's where there's a difference between a deaf film team and a hearing film team. Because all the film and TV shows and videos that are being produced about the village, there's always hearing people talking about the deaf villagers. You never see deaf people talking about themselves. It's very rare. And so that's where you really see how deaf ethnographic film is different. So yes, there are differences and still some challenges. From the clip that you saw earlier, you could see how deaf tourists wanted to connect with the deaf villagers. The challenge was there were still barriers. I experienced this as well. There's not that many interviews that I could include in the film, the interviews that I conducted with these deaf villagers, because, for example, I would interview the villager, and at the same time, it seemed that they sort of glaze over all researchers as representing the same thing. So they would show me deaf babies, they would show me their signs for things, they would talk about the deaf gene, and they do so because that's what their experience has been with previous researchers before me. So it was interesting to see how they are performing for the camera in different ways. So they would sign for the linguistic researchers, and that sort of thing. So that's part of the reason why there aren't very many interview clips, unfortunately, I'm sad to say, in the video. And part of that is because my own limitations with Katakulok, the language that they use. I learned it, but not fluent enough to be able to have a fully fledged communication conversation with a villager. I had enough to be able to get by, but not enough to get real deep, rich data. And so that's the reason why it's not included in the film. So the next part is I want to talk about the data collection and analysis with the film and what we can do with that. So deaf ethnographic film was a collection of hours and hours and hours of footage. And as we looked through this footage, we noticed the same thing that my colleagues had, my colleague Annalise had with her project. We found that deaf people would talk about calibrating. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this clip, but I will talk a little bit about calibration. It happens a lot. It happens a lot in deaf international spaces. There's an international sign. There's a multimodal calibration. They'll often use iconic, transparent signs. They'll also incorporate different signed languages as they communicate. Repetition, duplication is really important. Making edits as you sign, and an informal translation as well. So for example, let's say there's a group of signers. It doesn't necessarily have to be deaf people, but a group of signers. If one person doesn't understand something, the person next to them will try to clarify. It's really interesting how that's very much international sign language production and what we see in those spaces. And that's because there's a strong moral experience and effective responsibility in that connection. I think because of that shared experience of communication barriers and communication breakdowns, many deaf people truly invest in the exchange of communication. They really want to invest in the exchange, and they want to compare deaf experiences. And there's many of them that are going to accept that they don't understand everything. I should also add that the reason why International Sign is such an important part of the deaf international experience is because of the role that ASL, American Sign Language, has. And so ASL, it's kind of unfortunate as a person from the US and who has been using ASL for most of my life, ASL has a terrible reputation in the international space, and people will do anything possible to avoid using any obvious American Sign Language. And it can be really interesting to observe how deaf individuals, deaf signers, will twist themselves to each which way to avoid using an ASL sign, because it feels though that it's colonial. And so that moral consciousness and understanding of calibrating is to show respect for other signed languages. And that's very much a part of what I call the deaf cosmopolitan experience. So deaf cosmopolitanism is affective and practical calibration. So they view themselves very much as a citizen of the world, and how one becomes a cosmopolitanism person is they go and experience the world as a shopkeeper, they experience locals, and they really portray this attitude of being open to differences, being willing to connect, and also being self-aware that they have to calibrate themselves in order to suit the space. It also includes practices as translanguaging and the ability to show empathy. And like you saw in the interview previously, the deaf woman said, "We want to see how they live." That's the language that she used. And that's the strive for empathy. But as we saw, it didn't really turn out the way that people had anticipated. So calibration, alignment, and languaging is such a strong component, and it's a strong metaphor to describe deaf language practices. And calibrating is the theory that comes through in the film data that we have. We have data that we could see what people are doing first and foremost, how people are calibrating and aligning, and how they talked about that experience. So those two things became a new theory that emerged from this film making process. In the clip that maybe I'll show you after, but this is an image from the clip. It's called the Deaf Community Dinner. And in this part of the film, there is a deaf tour group. And this particular tour group has an American, a couple of Germans, a man from London, someone from France, and various other European countries and from the US. So when they get together with this Indonesian group of deaf people, they're trying to communicate. Even though every person there has a different language background, some of the deaf people there are not fluent signers. So in this image, you'll see a deaf woman from the US trying to explain Instagram. So she's talking about following someone on Instagram. That's the context of the conversation. And the deaf Indonesian is like, what is this woman saying? And so she fingerspells it. She tries to fingerspell it a couple of times. And then you see the deaf Indonesian woman say, oh, gotcha. Here is the Basindo sign for that. And Basindo is Indonesian Sign Language. That's the name of Indonesian Sign Language. And so you see her understand, and then she repeats it back in Basindo Sign Language. Then they start to compare everyone's sign. So somebody would say, oh, well, this is my sign for Instagram. And then somebody from a different country would say, this is how we sign Instagram. And so that is how they calibrate to each other. They then get to an understanding from there. And so this one example about calibration as a moral practice is how the ideology forms about language, sign language, that really shapes how people interact and their practice when they're using language. There's also a very strong moral concern about what language resources are appropriate, in which context, which locations. And there's a strong concern about ASL colonizing the space. So they'll use more visual, gestural, more space is being used. It becomes more inclusive. They're including people with various language backgrounds. And also learning another signed language as the exchange continues. And that's part of the good moral practice that you see. And here's another example. Oftentimes, deaf people will compare their finger spelling. So the man that you see here is from Carrar. Carrar is from London. And he is learning Basindo fingerspelling at this moment. He's also using American Sign Language and British Sign fingerspelling as a bridge, because Indonesian, so Basindo fingerspelling is very similar to BSL and their fingerspelling modality. So, so that exchange is simply trying to meet each other in the middle, right? So, and then the bottom of this image, the second image at the bottom, you see how people are feeding each other the signs. So if there's a situation where, so this guy who's Balinese, he is trying to fingerspell this word Lombok, and then you see the Indonesian woman go, oh, this is the sign for Lombok, which is an island. So these are different strategies that people use in the goal of connection. Here's another one. The example here was water. So all of this to say, I know it's a lot, what I'm trying to showcase is this is what you can do with deaf ethnographic filmmaking. The data itself becomes visible. You truly see how creative, strategic, and rich that sign language can be, and how deaf communication practices are so much more than just the language itself. It's so far beyond the language. And that's how you can start to balance the articles that are being published, the films that you see. Of course, we have to publish things. As academics, that's part of our expectation and responsibility. So the articles that you see published being paired with the film is a really nice combination. In articles, we can use a theory framework more obviously. The analysis is there pretty clearly. Articles have more details of strategies being used. Film, however, you can see the data for yourself. Transparent data is crucial because of representation. We're trying to represent deaf people in a different way than they have been historically, because we have a long history of really terrible academic work that says deaf people have essentially no language, have very limited language, have no literacy, low intellect, and a whole host of other fallacies. So with film, you can see that that is inaccurate, completely false. Film is also more accessible to a deaf audience. Regardless of the language use, deaf people can still see this film and have access to it. So in conclusion, filmmaking as a cosmopolitan practice really requires a cosmopolitanism exchange. You can see the process of calibrating, of aligning in the film. You can also see how that theory of deaf same doesn't quite work. You can see that with deaf people in the film. You can also see it with me as a researcher when my limitations are present, like my ability to use the local language. So that's where my perspective, my thinking, my ethics really come into play. I think that filmmaking is an ethical way to do research when you're talking about research done on deaf people. One ethical strategy is to use film. So that is it for my presentation. I think we may have some time for Q&A, so I'll go ahead and open it up for some Q&A.
Erin, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really, really insightful. I have some questions, but I want to open it up to the audience first and see if there are questions from the floor. But thank you very much. I just want to give everyone a moment. If you may turn your cameras on to sign your questions and the interpreters will help out. You may voice and the interpreters will help out. I'll break the ice then.
And do you see that Magdalena is on camera?
So Erin, again, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. One of the questions that I had, I want to make a quick comment first, which is to say that I really appreciate this idea of tourists seeking sort of a real experience, and that connection is part of that. We see that with hearing tourists also. Sometimes it's in the distance that you travel, that you spoke about with getting to the deaf village, right? It's the, arduousness of the journey that makes you feel like, you're doing something off the beaten track or whatever else. And I'm curious, I think that that's a sort of a tourist gaze in many ways. There are certainly differences that you point out. There are differences maybe between the deaf gaze and the hearing gaze, but I think that that's also sort of a tourist gaze. And I wonder if you also interviewed the people at Deaf Village about their experiences with these tourists, and if they talked about deaf same in some of the similar kinds of ways. And I do see other hands up too, so I'll mute myself now.
Yeah. I did interview certain people, but you're absolutely right. Some weren't just appropriate to put in the film. It was challenging because I was asking about the history of tourism. So I had to try different strategies. I sat with a deaf villager and went through their photo album. And so they were showing me things in their photo album, and I could see photos on their wall in their home. Many of them were photos of tourists and researchers, which is another way of using visual methods for conducting an interview. So I would point to this picture and I would ask what the story was behind it. Was this picture taken? I think at the same time, I felt like many of them knew how important tourism was for their families, for their income. So when I would ask about the impact on tourism, they would give me a thumbs up. Oh, it's an exchange. They would use the metaphor of this exchanging, giving something to get something. They kept talking about the exchange, but at the same time, I could see for myself that it wasn't an equal exchange. So that's where you would really see the difference between the interview, like what people would tell you in the interview, and what's actually happening in the field.
Thank you. I'll go on to, there's a question in the chat that I'll go ahead and read if you like. Erin Marie says, I was wondering more about how you did the ethnographic filmmaking process and how you worked to incorporate deaf gaze into it. Also, do you ever work with local deaf filmmakers? And she apologizes, she's not in a space where they're not in a space where they can turn on their camera.
Yeah. Ethnographic filmmaking. So when you talk about the process, so first I went to Bali for about 6 months, and then the film team came from Belgium. My original vision, which, as we know, if you're an anthropologist, you know how you have a project vision and then you get to the field site and it's completely different. Things just don't go as they plan. So my vision was to, this sounds very naive, in hindsight, but I was hoping to be able to provide deaf people in Bali with the skills that they could use so my original vision was to bring a trainer from Belgium. It's a team that I've worked with. And so I was going to bring this team to train Indonesians in Bali, to give them the equipment, show them how to use it. And then I got there and everyone already has jobs. Everybody already has other priorities. So no one was really interested or motivated in being a part of that project. So my vision of using local filmmakers wasn't possible. So that's how I ended up bringing in the team from Belgium. And it was a deaf filmmaker team. And so how that worked was 6 months of field work. I identified themes, things that I noticed that came up that I thought were important. I made a list of the different things that I felt that they should try in the film to try to capture. And so at the same time, that film was based on what was happening there during the 6 weeks the team was there. And so that's where it was really important to emphasize what's in the film is only based on that 6 weeks. It was only based on what they could capture from my 6 months of field work and their 6 months actually on site. So it's a mixture of strategies on how to really showcase what was the data that was coming up.
Fabulous, thank you. Amber has a question. Amber's got her hand raised.
Hello. I want to thank you for this presentation. I greatly enjoyed it. One of the things I found impactful is your discussion of the difference between the hearing gaze and the deaf gaze. Sort of the Japanese filmmakers, the French filmmakers who gravitate towards speaking to a hearing spokesperson on behalf of the deaf team or the deaf villagers. And I wonder if you agree, or maybe what your thoughts might be on this supposition that from some comments, the deaf gaze is, maybe there's an expectation, there's some romanticization going on in their expectations. There's something sort of romantic, of what they're going to see, of what, this wonderful deaf strong community is going to be like. And then they go and the expectations don't turn out to be true. So maybe they had some high expectations as opposed to perhaps the hearing gaze. I don't know what, if any, their expectations might be, but it seems like their view or their gaze might be maybe coming from like a pitying stance. So I just wonder if you agree with that perhaps dichotomization, or maybe that's not the right way to draw the binary, but what are your thoughts about some of the differences between the hearing and deaf gaze?
Yeah, so actually, I think that many deaf tourists also have that sense of pity and patronizing perspective, viewing them as very poor. That came up a lot. So it's similar in that regard. What I do think is different from me about the hearing gaze is who's speaking in the film, who's talking to the camera. So for example, the group from Singapore and Japan only interviewed the hearing people in the village. They didn't, and I don't know why, but they didn't try to get an interpreter to talk to the deaf villagers. And so you see that part where the film is cast on the deaf man's hands, right? So it frames the hands in that particular clip. And it's essentially disembodied from the person itself. And so it became more about deaf people as people who use their hands. It became all about their hands rather than the entire person. And there were like some benevolence that was clearly felt or shared.
Mm-hmm. Understand. Thanks so much.
Can we go to Magdalena with her hand raised?
Thank you. Thank you. It was really amazing and illuminating presentation. I also have a question regarding the deaf gaze. It really caught my attention. And my question is, if you consider deaf ethnographic filmmaking as a deaf gaze, and do you consider having being the someone who has or presents this deaf gaze in research, and do you use it as a research tool? And finally, if this research tool, if you agree with this, can be used in research, in ethnographic research in general, not only in deaf communities, but also in hearing communities. Yeah, that's from me. Thank you.
Definitely. Yeah. I think that both the deaf gaze and embodied experience as a deaf person. So the clip that I think might have been the first clip that I showed was a little bit confusing because I started at the wrong moment, but there is a portion of that clip where there's a lady that's talking about her cream that was taken by the monkey. And it wasn't until I watched that clip several times that I realized she's using different resources. And so she's saying the word yellow, like vocally, even though she's German, she's from Germany. Her original sign language is German Sign Language. She's using the spoken word for yellow. She's using gestures to indicate an iconic way of indicating the 10 with the crane. She's waving. She's trying to communicate with this gentleman who works at the Monkey Forest. And so I think that's where the deaf gaze can capture that, can start to explore that and do some micro-analysis of the exchange. And so much happened in that 30 seconds. And then I realized, oh, I do this too. I start to think about how I go to order coffee and how if the barista doesn't understand me, I immediately start to go through these strategies to achieve my objective of getting a coffee. So it's interesting to think about the sequence, the rapid sequence of strategies. So that's one example of how the deaf lens as a researcher we're able to capture things that perhaps another linguistic anthropologist may not capture because they're so focused on the language itself, the power that's being at play, and they're focused on other things. And so I think that all of us bring different skills to the situation. And I think that's where hearing anthropologists, hearing researchers can benefit from deaf gaze.
Wonderful, great answer and great question. Thank you, Magdalena. Bill Moody in the chat writes, how do you see the IS used in international conferences like the WFD differs from ethnographic film communication in signs? And we might remind the audience who may be unfamiliar that IS is International Sign and WFD stands for World Federation of Deaf.
Yeah, I really appreciate my colleague Annalise. She is an expert on international sign. And yes, the IS that you see at WFD is quite different because it's more conventionalized. It's been repeated more, so it becomes more standardized. I know oftentimes the same people go, there are interpreters present. So there's definitely a difference between the IS that's used in a more formal setting and an informal interaction. So an example would be platform, stage, international sign is more standardized, while a one-on-one intimate exchange with two people out on the street might be more gestural. They may be making more accommodations to make sure that they are understood and make a connection. And so that's where you see how language is so tied to the body and so tied to the context and who is there. The practice that happens at a conference like WFD is not going to happen in the deaf community, for example. So that's where it's really important to look at the context and how the feasibility is, what is present and how that influences the people that are there. Also, ideology. Hopefully that answers your question, Bill.
What other questions or comments might we have? While we're waiting for other questions, I also wanted to comment and really show some appreciation for this idea of the calibration. And I'm curious to know if you theorize that also as, it's a moral obligation, but there's labor also. There is a labor there. And I'm sure you've talked about it a little bit today, but sometimes that extra labor makes us more invested in work. Like, for example, we might have a different experience with a text that we're reading, as opposed to for those of us that are hearing, listening to that text. it's a different kind of engagement through work. And so I wonder if you theorize it that way, as this kind of, it's an extra investment, but also that's also illustrative of the kinds of experiences that deaf people have often, that hearing people aren't always understanding of, is that extra labor that can be so exhausting, that so many things take these, 100 steps within 30 seconds to get to the understanding. Very many people hearing people don't understand that.
Yeah, I think that is one thing that Annalise definitely discovered. Also, Mara Gren, who has done beautiful work, amazing work. So Mara has inspired a lot of my thinking, Annalise as well. So they talk about how IS in informal settings, there's an investment in labor that's there, and that's why it's so important to value that, because IS is more about the process of calibrating, and that labor is part of the joy. That's part of the fun. That's part of the drive and the interest of IS.
What other questions or comments? Oh, Sarah has their hand raised. Go right ahead.
Hi.
So my question is tied to the ASL and sort of the history. So as we know, that ASL has disseminated itself widely across the world, and in some ways is dominant over other sign language. You talked about that a little bit earlier. Other countries have a negative view of ASL as a result. I wonder if you could briefly touch on some of the histories, how that came to be.
Sure. Yeah, so ASL is one of the most documented languages. ASL also is used in mission work and mission contexts. It's also very centralized at Gallaudet University. It's the world's only university for deaf people. So people who graduate from Gallaudet go to home, and that could be a different country, or they do mission work. They go and establish deaf schools in different countries. So it's a combination of different things. Annalise Custer has an article about that, and I think it was published last year. But in short, it's through deaf education philosophy, mission work, and just human travel, just humans traveling themselves, it becomes a corpus. One woman from the US has become an ambassador, so to speak, an unofficial ambassador for total communication. So she travels representing the Peace Corps, and that's part of how ASL has been disseminated. Now, at the same time, it's really interesting because even though ASL has been widely disseminated, there's still a lot of resistance towards it. So people talk about ASL as a colonial practice, but it's also fascinating to see how people are actively resisting against that. So that's the history. Today, ASL and IS is also disseminated through vlogs, social media, Instagram, and those types of platforms. So I would encourage for you to look at Annalise's article, who really is a good explanation of that.
I will, thank you.
Thank you again. Am I missing any hands up? Are there other questions quickly? We're coming to the end of our time together. I just want to thank you again for your time and the preparation you put into this. We will make the video recording available through our DHI website. and webpage on our past events. So we're happy to share your work more broadly that way, and continue this discussion, as I'm sure many of us are inspired to do. Your presentation really has given us all a lot to think about. And I also just want to say a word of thanks to our interpreting team, Sarah Blattberg, forgive me, and Shret Garate Estes of Garate Estes Interpreting Services. Any final comments from you, Erin, or the audience?
You know, it's really hard to capture all of the nuances. I think I might have glazed over some things. So please do watch the film. We also have an FAQ page, which explains a bit about how we made the film on our website. It's mobiledef.org.uk. So the film is there. Please let me know if you use that for teaching or any type of other material that you create. And thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to see you, Anne. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Shret. Thank you, audience, for being here. It's been a fantastic discussion.
Thanks again.